So hi everyone, welcome to the talk. Good afternoon. So this event is hosted by the RISD Architecture Affinity Group, and the event is being recorded. So if you have any thoughts, welcome to use our Q&A functions in the meeting. So I will give a brief introduction to myself as well as Alexandra Gadawski before her presentation. So I'm Xuan Wang. I graduated from RISD with my MArch degree in 2019. Currently, I'm working in Boston for architecture design. I got involved into the RISD Architecture Affinity Group from last year. Currently, is the co-leader for the group with Dan Gamachi, whom based in Los Angeles. And well, we are so happy to have Alexandra Gadawski for the talk. And thanks for Tri's help too. Alexandra is a great designer. She holds a Master of Science in Environmental Design of Building from Cardiff University in UK and an MArch from RISD. Alexandra currently is an architect and sustainability leader at HMFH Architect in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Where her passion for building performance and knowledge of lighting design has made her crucial to project at every stage. Alexandra uses her skill set to push sustainable initiative and assist in problem solving for complex designs. Her commitment to promoting students' wellness is reflected in her daylighting and energy modeling, which maximize the daylighting in learning environments for students, as well as her comprehensive research of healthy material options and work in integrating life cycle assessment into the project workflow. So we are so excited to welcome Alexandra Gadawski. Now, Alexandra, I think you can share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me today and for that introduction. Today, I'm looking forward to being here and to talking to you about designing around material transparency. So before we get into this, I'd really like to talk about why you would consider material transparency on your projects and why this is important. Over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, the knowledge in the area of material transparency has grown exponentially. More than ever before, we have an ability to understand what's going into the products we specify and really make informed decisions about what we put into our buildings. I think the more that we know about the products that go into our buildings, the more information we have, the greater our responsibility is to use that information to make the best possible choices as it relates to material health, occupant health, and the well-being of everyone involved in the process. So not only is material transparency something that impacts the end users of our building, this could impact those people who are living near the source of extraction, people who are living near a forest or a mine, people who are involved in the manufacturing and the installation. So not only do we want to consider the impact on our end users, we now have information to consider the impacts of people all along the supply chain. And I think that's really important to take into consideration. I think we might also have project-specific reasons or personal reasons for considering this. It was mentioned briefly in the introduction, but I primarily work designing public K-12 schools. And so I think that adds a different level of consideration. I'm going to borrow a phrase from one of my colleagues, but they have said that children are not small adults. So that we know now that not only do children interact differently with materials, they are more sensitive to the impacts of their environment, be that, the chemical components in a carpet or, wall coverings. So those things are more impactful in children. So I feel like that adds another level of consideration. And designing public schools, I think there's also an issue of equity. We want to make sure that everyone has access to really great spaces with really healthy materials. And material transparency is what allows us to make those decisions. So I'd like to talk a little bit. You've probably seen that people, planet, profit, or environmental, social, economic filters They're often used when talking about sustainability and sustainability decision making. We have a fourth one here, which is educational sustainability, which I added. That's very project specific to us. But I think it's really important when we're talking about, the whys in material transparency to look at that in the bigger project context and the bigger sustainability context, and to think about what defines sustainability for your projects and where does material selection and material transparency fit into that process. So looking through these different lenses, environmental, economic, social, and educational, we're looking to set material goals that check all of these boxes, because I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with the value engineering process or, cost savings measures. And if you're setting goals and it's great for the environment, but it's, not socially responsible or not, economical in your project, it's very likely that those goals are going to fall off through the course of the project. So when you're setting material goals, if you can have a goal that checks multiple boxes, those are the things that we see as likely to stay in the project. So in the same way you would set other sustainability goals, I'd like you to, think about how you can set goals around the materials that go into your building and how they can sort of be analyzed through these different filters. So I think an important thing to talk about is that when you're looking at material goals the same way you do as other goals, looking at these as early as possible in the project is really important, because the earlier you make these decisions, the easier it is and the less expensive it is for the most part. So the project kickoff meeting is this really exciting point where you have an opportunity to set ambitious goals around materials and establish priorities that will transfer through the whole project. There's been a lot of talk over the last year about energy, and I think most people are familiar with setting energy goals and conveying those to all of their consultants. You would talk to your engineers, you would talk to the people involved in lighting. And the same way you do that, we're really trying to integrate goal setting around materials in the same way. So it's something that you talk about at your kickoff meeting, you're in pre-design, you set goals, you have metrics, and in the same way that you would track other goals or other design changes across the phase, we're really talking about materials right from the beginning, right through the end, through design and construction, and also into occupancy and thinking about refurbishments, retrofits, recycling, and where the products we're specifying are going, at the end of their life. So we really take this project, long-range project view and a holistic look at materials, and we are starting early. So to set the stage for this, I'd like you to think about the materials that go into your building. How many hundreds or even thousands of products come together to make your building? And those could be the things that you really think about from an aesthetic lens, what kind of tile you want, what kind of wall covering, what you want the floor to look like, how do those material decisions play into your visual and aesthetic goals, and also the things that you might not really think about from a design perspective, all those, adhesives and sealants and all of those little things. And it's a huge number of products. And every time you're specifying a product, you have an opportunity to increase the sustainability and material health of your project. And I think that's really exciting. You have thousands and thousands of opportunities on every job to really make a positive impact. I think it's also worth thinking at this point about who specifies these materials, because I think coming from the architecture perspective, you think, oh, I'm sort of in charge of most of what goes into the building. You've got the overarching design vision, but if you really think about it, your structural engineer is specifying a huge portion of materials. Someone who's designing the mechanical system, the electrical engineer, fire protection. So there's a huge number of material decisions going on in all disciplines. I think, just when you think about that, think about the proportion of what's going into the building and how you would really need to have, all of your consultants and the whole team on board if you want to make an impact in this area. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where we get material information, because part of making good decisions is having good information. And there are many, many standards related to material transparency. There's just, you can see on the slide here, just a few of them, but there are many more. And today I'm going to focus in on just a few standards that we use quite frequently in our decision making and sort of narrow it down and talk about why I think those ones are really important. I'd like to start off talking about the health product declaration and the environmental product declaration. You often see EPD and HPD sort of together in the same sentence, but really they're looking at very different things. So if you have an HPD, you're going to be looking at, it's going to be telling you the contents of your product and the associated human health impacts. So the human toxicity impacts and the ecotoxicity impacts. If you have an environmental product declaration or EPD, you're really looking at how the product impacts the environment over its life cycle. So you can see here that's divided up into 6 categories, and those are all related to environmental impacts. So depending on what you want to monitor and what you're assessing about your product, you're probably going to need to be looking at multiple declarations. You're not going to get all of the information you need from one label or one certification. So you need to think in your project specific context, what you really need to get a well-rounded view of the materials you're specifying. And I'd also like to talk briefly about the declare label. So the declare label tells you 3 main things. It's looking at where your product is coming from, what it is made of, and where it goes at the end of its life cycle. You can also see here at the bottom, it also has this living building challenge criteria, and that's related to the red list. So the red list lists worst in class materials and chemicals that are known to cause serious risk both to human health and the environment. And there are hundreds of chemicals on this list. And so this label can let you know if this product is free of those chemicals, if it's simply declaring that they're there, or if it's red list approved. So I think this is a really important label and one that we talk about a lot in our office. So as we get further into material transparency, I'd like to break this down into 2 sections, which are material health and embodied carbon. Sorry about that. I want to start off talking about embodied carbon. So we talked a little bit at the beginning how most people are really familiar with setting energy goals, and energy goals are very closely related to operational carbon. So embodied carbon is really looking at the carbon footprint of a material from cradle to grave. So that's right from the point of extraction of the material through the transportation, the manufacturing, transportation again to the job site, the construction of the building, demolition, waste, recycling, and really right to the end of life. And I think this is a really important metric. This is looking at the greenhouse gas impacts of that whole process. And you often see this number as a CO2 equivalent. And if you're wanting to get more information about this, you're typically going to be looking to a EPD. So if I want to make a decision about lowering the embodied carbon of my building, that's what I'm going to be looking for. And this is a really important component of the overall carbon footprint of your building. So this graph is from the Architecture 2030 Challenge, and it's looking at total carbon emissions of new construction. And what you can see is that by 2050, when sort of a business as usual case, embodied carbon is going to be responsible for approximately 50% of the carbon footprint. And that's a really impactful chunk. So when we're designing, we really want to be thinking, we put a lot of thought into the materials we're selecting and how they can impact this footprint. And I think it's important to note the embodied carbon of your building is set when the building is constructed. There's nothing you can do to lower that number over time. Now, your operational carbon, maybe in 10 years, Boston is going to have a completely renewable energy grid, fingers crossed. And our operational carbon will drop, but there's nothing we can do once we've made those material decisions to lower our embodied carbon. So it's really crucial that we're thinking about this early in the project, because moving forward, this is going to be a huge portion of our building's footprint. So I'd like to talk a little bit about life cycle assessment. You can see here, this is from the London Energy Transformation Initiative, and they're breaking down where the embodied carbon impact is in a few different kinds of structures. And you can see how this breaks down by discipline. So then if we look at this in a different way, you can see here, facades and internal finishes are called out, and those are the products that typically fall under the purview of the architect. So you can see in the office, for example, we might be responsible for only 20% of the embodied carbon impact. And I think what these graphs are really showing is the importance of having all of the disciplines, all of your consultants, your entire project team on board with your goals related to materials, because our firm has been working really hard to revamp our material library, to look at embodied carbon, but we might only in schools be responsible for a little over 30% of the embodied carbon impact. So if we work really hard, we make these great material choices, say we reduce our embodied carbon impact by 10% or even 15%, we're still only touching a small portion of that pie. So if we really want to be making a big move, really taking control of the sustainability in our projects, we have to have everyone on board. And I think that's what this really highlights. So one of the things we've been really doing to look at embodied carbon is we have been trying to introduce life cycle assessment into our projects. We are currently doing this really to comply with the LEED credit. So to this point, there might be other people in the office who's looked at it a little bit more deeply. I've only on projects that I've been working on, looking at the core and the shell. But we're trying to really integrate this as much as possible so that we can be setting a baseline so that we understand what the embodied carbon impacts of our typical building is, because we still are at a point where we need to know what that baseline is and what we're improving from. So that's something that we've been working as an office to integrate in our workflow. So that's been really exciting. So you can see on one side, we've got a Tally, which is the software we're using to do this, and our Revit model. And then on the left, you can sort of see the finished product. And I think it's important to really make that connection. All this information that you're putting into Revit is going to turn into, real materials in the real world with real impacts. So then I wanted to talk about some of the things that we're considering as we're looking at goals around embodied carbon. And those might vary by project, but I'm just going to talk about a couple here. So I think the sort of low-hanging fruit with embodied carbon is simply to use fewer materials. To really think, if you're using, for example, a wood structure, can you design the structure in a way that's inherently beautiful and you don't feel the need to hide it? So leaving that exposed, you're not using additional wall finishes, additional ceiling finishes. On the left, you can see an example where we are targeting acoustic treatment only to where we need it most. So we're not having ceilings all the way in a corner, just in a project area, because I think this is, it sounds sort of obvious using fewer materials, less than zero impact, but I think it's really important to consider in the design. And again, it's something you're going to need to coordinate with your consultants, because if you're, luing your finishes, you don't want to have, massive ductwork. Or uncoordinated systems. So that's something that you also want to start talking about early, and a really great way to lower your embodied carbon impact. So then sort of once we've talked about using fewer materials, we really get into material selection and how we can be picking materials that have lower embodied carbon. So for this, we're really looking for products that have an EPD. Now, just having an EPD doesn't necessarily mean it's a good product. It's just telling you what the product has in it and what its impacts are. So you still need to make an evaluation between different products with EPDs. We're getting to a point now, particularly on interior finishes, where we have a lot of options, but we're still at a point where we need to push for more transparency so that we can make those evaluations. I primarily work on public works. That means we need to specify 3 equal products. And as you move from the interior into, facade systems and exterior components, it can be harder to find that transparency documentation. So, that's a big push right now, I think, is really just asking for material transparency so we can evaluate the materials we're selecting and really look at what might have a lower embodied carbon. Another thing we might think about when we're doing this is looking at where the materials are coming from, not just what they're made, and what the transportation impacts might be and how that might impact the carbon footprint of our building. So I've talked about this a couple times, but sort of the next step is then to talk about interdisciplinary collaboration and making sure that, everyone is on board with the material goals and everyone is contributing what they can. Here you can see an example of a ceiling and skylight with a light fixture, and really, I think we're all very familiar, say, with asking your electrical engineer, your lighting designer, we really want to lower the light power density. We want to use less energy, but I think people are less familiar with saying to electrical engineer, what really goes into the materials that you're specifying? How is this going to impact our carbon footprint? So really kicking off those discussions. And I think I've found that people are often very excited to be engaged in that. And even if they're not familiar, they're really interested in doing the research. And I think, the more information you come to those meetings with, the better. Sometimes you really have to ask the pointed questions to get to the answers that you need. But in the same way that architecture has sort of low-hanging fruit, I think, most disciplines do as well. And, can you be empowered to go to your lighting designer and say, I really don't want to have PVC in any of our wiring. Here's a list of chemicals of concern that we have. I think also being open to really discipline-specific knowledge. And when you have people on board earlier in the process, I think there's some things that you can do. If you have this conversation with your mechanical engineer earlier in the design, is there a way that you can say, locate mechanical rooms so that your duct runs are shorter and you're losing less material? So I want to emphasize how important this is to get everyone involved and how we can't do this just by ourselves in architecture. And then I'm going to pull out structure specifically, because structure is usually a huge component of the embodied carbon footprint. So having those discussions is really important. So the materials you select, that could be concrete, it could be steel, it could be wood. Really looking at the embodied carbon, all those materials. We've done, on the last project I worked on, there was quite a bit of work done with the mix of the concrete. And that's something the users are never going to see. It doesn't look any different. But by changing those things, you're tweaking the embodied carbon footprint. And I think also thinking beyond materials into what kind of design decisions in structure could really result in using less materials. Where can you gain efficiency, and how flexible from the architecture perspective are you prepared to be when you're working with your structural engineer to, say, change column spacing or other things like that might feel like design decisions to really work on improving the sustainability of your project. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about material health. It's sort of a second level of looking at material transparency. So again, I'd like to talk, about some goals that we are looking at with regards to material health. So I think one of the sort of, preliminary goals, and one of the things that's really nice to think about, is touch surfaces. So you might say anything 8 feet and down in your building that people are going to be interacting with, doorknobs, benches, wall coverings, carpets. The materials that people are going to be engaging with most directly. What can we really work on to optimize the material health of those things? Because those are high interaction areas. And so that seems like a really good place to start. If you're not going to, work on this, you don't have the ability on a specific project to look at, every second material. I think this is a good starting place and something we often talk about as focusing on. And I think the second sort of step would be that we'd be looking at all of your interior finishes. The amount of disclosure around interior products has ballooned dramatically over the last 5 years. So even on public projects where we need 3 equals, it's typically possible to get red list free products for interior finishes. And I would say not only is it possible to do that, you're able to do that without having it impact your design. The level of selection there, is there, and I think that's really exciting. So you can choose these healthier materials, and it's not even a design decision. So I think that's really great. As you move to, say, interiors, if you want exteriors rather, if you want that level of disclosure, it is likely going to be a design driver. And then next, I'd like to talk about opportunities by program. So if you don't have the ability to really focus in on material health, in every single aspect of their building, are there specific areas where you might want to narrow your focus? On the left, you can see 2, little children looking through a window. Talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but, young children are far more impacted by their surroundings. So do you have, a pre-K where it might be really important in a few rooms to focus in on this, because I'm sure we've all seen children and the number of things that they touch and they put in their mouth and how they're engaging with their surroundings. And so I think, if you think of that, you think, oh yeah, it's like really important what the carpet is made out of in a way that it might not be for adults. And on the left, you can see a picture from a vocational style school. It's a, sort of a community health program, and really thinking that there's been a lot of work in the last couple of years on healthcare facilities. And if you're having, people who might be more vulnerable, how can we think of, materials around that situation? So, if we're looking at a community health facility in a vocational high school, how can we set that up to mimic the conditions that are coming through the hospital environments, sort of mimicking those real considerations and taking that on board. So those are just two examples, but I think, in every building, if you can't focus in on the whole building, and that might be possible because there are certainly constraints, maybe there's just a couple of spaces that you can really look at improving. And then I'd like to talk about what I consider to be my highest goal. And this is very personal, and it can, and I think it will shift and evolve as we can continue to get more material transparency. But right now, I would say my sort of highest objective is looking for products that are red list free, that have product-specific environmental product declarations, so that we can really use that information to evaluate the materials and then pick the better materials. Because if we don't have the ingredients, we don't have that background information, we can't make informed decisions. So getting that declaration and those declarations and really being able to evaluate is really important. That's really what I'm pushing for on my projects right now. And hopefully in the future, there'll be greater transparency, and something that we won't really have to think about as much. But I think right now it's something that it's really important to be pushing on your projects. So there's a couple ways that we're doing this. We have been working for the last couple of years to revamp our physical library in the office. And we picked the mindful materials labeling system. So now our physical samples in the office have a small logo on the spine and a bigger sticker on the front cover that says what kind of declarations they have. And they also have an online database, which in our sort of move to a more virtual world has been really important. And so to be a part of this database, materials need to have some type of transparency disclosure. And it's broken up into 4 main categories, which are material ingredients, environmental profile, volatile organic compounds, and material sourcing. And you can see on the top the different logos that products would have to fall into those categories. And so, if we see the mindful materials label, we know it has some kind of disclosure. So that's a really, sort of important first step. And you might see on the right-hand side, the little logo, and they're also working on having a new category related to social responsibility. So that's sort of in process, but there are also a few labels related to that. I think, over the last year, social responsibility, equity, and justice has really come to the forefront. And so that's another layer that we can consider as we're making our material decisions. Where does our material come from? Who might be impacted along the supply chain? Does the company that makes it have, responsible manufacturing and employment practices? So I think it's really exciting that that's an area where there's starting to be more information. So as I said before, you can see a little snippet of our material library. So that's what we've been doing, is physically all of those samples, putting those stickers on. And not only have we been sort of doing this research on a project-specific basis, we're really trying to revamp the whole way that we look at materials so that nothing is coming into the office without some level of transparency disclosure. And I think, we've been remote for a while, so you kind of forget. But when you're in the office, you have lunch and learns, you have manufacturing reps stopping by, you have people sort of cold calling and sending you samples. And we've really been working on templates so that anyone who's encountering a rep or anyone can say, you know what, do you have these sort of 3 types of disclosures that we're looking for? Because if you don't, we don't even want your sample in the office. We don't want it to be an option for our project. So we've really been pushing that in our physical library. Because I think it's important that not only do we have project-specific goals, but this is something that we're looking at really holistically, and it's sort of percolating into the way our office operates and relates to our overall office sustainability goals. So the other thing that we have been done as an office, we had our 50th anniversary a few years ago, and part of that was that we decided that one of our office sustainability goals was to be carbon neutral. So we looked at we spent a year really looking at tracking, our commutes, our job site transportation, office operations. We had people who were measuring and weighing sort of garbage going out of our building and really trying to get our heads around what our operational footprint might be. Once we sort of got a sense of what that number has been, we are purchasing carbon offsets. So we've been operating as a carbon neutral office, and that's really exciting. So I'm sure people can imagine during the design process, you get all these samples. During the construction process, you're getting submittals. So really, dealing with those samples, there's an environmental impact of that, both in the shipping and how they get to your office, and how do you dispose of them if you have all these carpet tiles? Are you making sure that you're sending them back to the manufacturer properly and not just throwing them out? Are they getting recycled? So one of the things that we've done over the last year that I was really excited about is that we're one of the founding carbon neutral partner firms with Material Bank's carbon neutral sampling program. So this is sort of an online material physical sample library, and they are tracking the carbon associated with the shipping of their samples and offsetting that. So that's something that's been really exciting and plays into our larger material goals for the office. So that was something that I was excited about. And they also take everything that you order, you can send it back to them. So that sort of gets rid of some of the impacts that we had around the disposal of our samples. So those are sort of two really office initiatives that we've been looking at. So I'd just like to end and sort of summarize a few things related to sustainable visioning and advocacy. So I think we're still really early on in the material transparency conversation. There's been tons of work done over the last few years, and there's certainly more information than there has been previously, but there are still huge gaps. So I think it's really important that as designers, we're all advocating for this information. I think we've become very accustomed, for example, to seeing labels on any food you buy. You would accept that as standard, that, if you buy a box of cereal, it's going to tell you what's in it. And I think we want to be at the place where, in that same way, that type of disclosure is standard on every one of the thousands of products that goes into our building. We can look at it and say, oh yeah, this is exactly what's going into it. And we just expect to get that information. So I think, we all have a role in that type of advocacy, and just asking every time, do you have any transparency disclosure? Because I think the more and more people hear that, the more they realize that there's a demand that sort of snowballs, and we continue to get better and better information. And that's the information that's really the foundation of making informed decisions and improving the sustainability of the built environment. So we're making sure that we're asking that at every stage of the project, that we're talking about it with the clients, and that we're really discussing that across the entire project team. And I think in terms of sustainability visioning, we really want to be looking at material goals the same way we look at any other goals for the project, be that energy, be that aesthetic goals, be that programming or functional goals. This is something that's really baked into our process right from the beginning. And not only do we have these goals, that we develop tracking metrics around them, because it's very hard to know if you're hitting your goal if you don't have some type of metric. If you just say, I want to do a better building, I want better materials, that's very hard to act on. So could you say, I have these 3 spaces where I'm going to go all red list free, or I want, this percentage for improvement of my embodied carbon footprint. So I think those specifics are very linked to the project and the function, but I think that's really important to think about. And also, really not only having those metrics, but assigning responsibility so that, everyone in their own disciplines understands the role that they can play in achieving those goals, and that they're sort of accountable for their slice of the pie. So this is a subject that I feel really strongly about. And I'm happy that I had this opportunity to share a little bit about some of the issues that our office and that I've been working on related to material transparency, material health, and embodied carbon. So I really appreciate the opportunity I had today to come and talk about this. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really an impressive presentation. And thanks for sharing for your research and project. It's really great. So all the attendees, if you have any question, you're welcome to use our Q&A sections in the meeting. There is someone, Peter Lawrence, asking, could you, thanks for a very useful presentation. Could you send a copy of the RISD certification and what they covered that you are working with?
Yeah, if I can definitely send that to you if you have the ability to circulate that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Chi can help that, right, Chi? Yeah, I think he can help for that. Yeah. Well, it's really a great presentation. I actually have some questions. So you said I think HMFH is mainly due for K-12 projects. And you also mentioned several projects you guys did for like material healthy for children's. I'm just wondering, do you guys also do some research for psychology or behaviors of the children? Like kind of related with your material selections and sustainable design, several stuff?
The short answer is no, not directly. We do a little. We have done some early childhood work, but I think the psychology aspect of it is definitely outside my area of expertise. We certainly try and design spaces that are appropriate for all of our users, no matter what their age. You know, and try and think about the scale of that picture with the two little children. You know, we had the low, sometimes you have borrowed lights between spaces, and those are probably 18 inches off the floor. But that's not the type of research that I've been involved with at all.
I see. Got you. Yeah. So how about the construction cost compared with the like a general building, what we have for current day for now? Do you have a better sense about the construction cost for that? Will that be more expensive if you, let's say, select some material, they are really good for sustainable or they are really good for healthy? Will that be increase the construction cost?
You know, I don't have a sort of direct numbers comparison. I think that really the cost comes in on the time that it takes you to do the research during the design, not that the materials are specifically more expensive. You know, particularly in interiors, there are tons of options, and many of them are just versions of the products we would have been specifying anyway. So there might be a carpet manufacturer that we use on all our projects, and it has one line that's red list free. So there's, you know, no cost impact there. You know, and I think if we're looking at the project holistically, if we're really looking at using less material, I think there can actually be cost savings associated with some of these things.
I see. But I think the building, like, I'm not sure about others, but for well and lead building, you will get a tax deduction, right, for the building if you build.
That I don't know about. I know in Massachusetts for public schools, which is what I'm most familiar with, you can get an extra reimbursement from the MSBA for getting a certain number of lead points.
Yes. So yeah, if the construction cost is kind of rise up, you can kind of get something back from that, maybe. Yeah. I do have I'm wondering about, you said about the life cycle assessment for your project. Do you guys have a kind of period time for each of the, based on different material, or you have a standard like period for almost all the building? Let's say maybe for concrete, I will do like 20 years from the beginning to it needs to be replaced, or you will like maybe do a 20 years for all of them, kind of compare them. Yeah.
So when we're doing our life cycle assessment, so far what we've been doing is really aligning with the LEED guidance. So that's asking you to look at your building over a 60-year time span. So there are some materials over that, like say your steel structure, which aren't going to get replaced. And as you're putting in information about your different materials, you might say have a 15-year lifespan for carpet, which means that it will go through 4, say, refurbishments in that time frame.
I see. Got you. Yeah. So we have a question from the Q&A. So it's how should governments play a role in encouraging material transparency? You mentioned the nutrition information on food. Yeah.
I mean, I would love if it was mandatory to have full disclosure for every building material that was sold. And I actually think that's a great question. And I think there's a lot we can do to advocate when we're talking to manufacturers and suppliers, as well as, political advocacy, or, talking to, I suppose, advocating for not political advocacy, but advocating for certain legislation that would mandate transparency, disclosure. And we've talked about LEED, but I think LEED really changed the marketplace in a number of areas related to sustainability. And I think, so we can see how the market can shift when there are standards and requirements, and that's a really powerful tool. And I think, right now the material credits in LEED, the material disclosure credits, you can often get just with interior finishes. And I would love to see there be a requirement that you need disclosure for all the areas, that you need, a little bit of disclosure for electrical, a little bit of structural, because I think that would really move the market if we said, not only do you need, 20 EPDs, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but, we also need 5 from MEP, because I think that really, those kind of standards really have the power to shift the market.
I see. Is there any like incentives elements for the material supply from either the state government or the federal government? Do you know that? Will they get something like back from the government?
Not that I know of.
I see.
But I'm not very familiar with that, the incentives on that end.
I see. Got you. Yeah. Well, you also mentioned there are lots of, I remember that you showed several charts like MEP and architecture, superstructure, how they contribute to the sustainability. So you said it's better to collaboration with all of the consultants and other peoples together to make the sustainability more successful. Do you have any tips for collaboration? I mean, for or during the architecture design and all probably moving for the construction. Yeah.
I think my biggest tip for collaboration is that you really need to have this conversation as early in the project as possible, because particularly with structure, as you mentioned, this could be really a design decision. And I think, I would start off by saying to, everyone in their own discipline, what is the low hanging fruit? What is the easiest, no design impact, no cost that we can do to improve material health and material transparency of our project? Because I'm sure they all will have, a few little things. I think, I'd mentioned I happen to work in the area of lighting, so I'm a little more familiar with that. But PVC free is for the most part, we know PVC is an issue, and it's often an easy substitute to make. So I think that's, a good question to ask, and to say what's the current state of knowledge and information in your discipline, and how can we bring that into this project? Because I think, we talk about this a lot in our office, and I feel very strongly about it, but, you might have a consultant that feels very strongly about it for a reason, doesn't feel empowered to just bring it up at a meeting. But maybe if you ask the question, they're gonna be like, I was just at this great conference, and I feel really excited about this, and, here's something that we can, maybe try out on this project.
I see. So is that happened to you before? Like someone wants to change the material in the middle of the design, something? Well, that happens to you?
I think, yes. I mean, we've definitely gone through design changes at every stage of the process. And I think, whether you're a designer in architecture or any other field, you know how much more work that generates than, having made the choice early on. And it can make detailing more complicated. It can just sort of really increase the work and the time that you have to spend on it.
I see. So usually the working the project duration, the project length will be kind of longer than general projects, right? Because you need to like balance and negotiate between different consultants and as well as with the client for the sustainable goal, right? I assume that, yeah.
I would say that the project duration will be the same. I've actually never experienced it extending the length of the project, but I think, you know, I guess maybe the better way to put it is integrating it earlier on is going to be more efficient, and it's going to let you focus on other things. You know, it's going to let, you know, you could spend the time doing research on materials, or you could spend, you know, you have that office standard, you know what the good materials are, and you're able to, you know, do more iterations of the design of a space. You know, given your time constraints, how can you balance those things?
Yeah. So I got another question. What are other general tips you have on low-hanging fruit? It's a funny question.
So general tips. So low-hanging fruit, I think, is, you know, things that we can do, sort of easy wins with material health. And I think architecture, it's really the interiors. I think we have such great disclosure in that area. I don't want to say there's no excuse for interiors, but the information is definitely there. And I don't think it needs to impact your design. You've got enough options there. And then, you know, sort of working your way out to the building envelope, I think it gets increasingly more complicated. You know, what are a few other tips we might have, you know, and I think, I guess another tip is, are there materials that you're using in multiple places? So for example, we've been looking at different mixes of concrete. And, you know, we have those conversations with our structural engineer, but we also have a lot of concrete out on the site. So that, you know, we can take that knowledge that we're getting from structural, and can we have that same conversation with civil and landscaping? You know, are there overlaps or synergies there? Because if, you know, we're doing something really great, it's the same product, can we make sure that everyone is specifying it? Or taking those same considerations into account when they're specifying. I mean, well, obviously it'd be slightly different concrete if, you know, it's a landscape element than a foundation, but, you know, I think some of the principles are the same. And how can we as architects really be the sort of link between those conversations and those disciplines?
Yeah, that's really important. You kind of in the bridge between different peoples. Yeah. Okay, so is there any other questions? I think that's all the questions I saw from the Q&A. So I think that's all the questions. So thank you, Alexandra. I think we learned a lot from you, and we hope you can achieve your goals, as you said from your presentation. And we really hope we can see lots of stuff, not just in Massachusetts, but as well as the whole country. They can achieve some goals before 2015. Maybe like in 5 years, we finger crossed. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah. Thanks for everyone. So it's so excited to meet everyone here. And we will keep posting for our future events. And please come to join us if you want to be a part of the RISD Architecture Affinity Alumni Group. So thanks again, and have a good day for everyone. Thank you so much.